And welcome back to the Space Madness Podcast, episode 40, getting really close to the initial goal of 50, but I'll probably call season one. So today we have a previous guest back with us again, and but a couple of things have changed. One, he's in a new firm, so I want to give him a chance to talk about that. But also, a certain space company that ends with the letter X has filed a very unusual document with the federal government that's being reported on in different ways, ranging from saying it's a plan to launch 1 million satellites or it's a application to launch 1 million satellites. Just a strange thing that being filed with the FCC. I thought we'd get back on with our favorite FCC lawyer, Will Lewis, and just explore it, because it is a strange thing for any company to have done. So, Will, welcome back. Please go ahead and introduce yourself again. And we do have to make a few things clear because it's live. It's a live regulatory matter. And of course, you can feel free to say all those things, but go ahead.
Well, thank you, Jeff. First of all, great to be back here. Always enjoy talking about these things with you, and I'm excited to discuss this. So I am now at, as you mentioned, Wilkinson Barker Knauer, which is a telecommunications firm in DC, and I'm part of a really great satellite regulatory team. So it's been really nice, particularly with something like this going on, to have folks to chat with about it and try to get a better grasp of this. I also just want to sort of explicitly state that anything I say on this podcast is for either educational or commentary purposes. Does not create entertainment, exactly.
Sure.
And does not create an attorney-client relationship with anyone listening. And also want to clarify that the views I express here today do not necessarily reflect my firm, the partners of the firm, or any of my clients. So with that said, I'm very eager to sort of hear what you're thinking and see if I can sort of add any color to it.
Well, thank you. And I should also say that this episode is brought to you by, I've never been able to say that before, my book that's coming out in a few weeks called How to Do Business with NASA. And it is about contracts, grants, other mechanisms that actually get things done, get things paid for, I should say. And if your goal is to work with NASA in any way, it's worth a read. So I'll have a link in the description. So I think we should start with really what was filed and what is the normal way of doing things? Because I think a lot of listeners will know what the FCC is, but what kind of application and how do these things work in a normal sense when there's not 1 million satellites in the documents?
Well, that's a great question, right? Just set a baseline of what we'd normally expect to see. So the FCC has rules for space station applicants, and they say, hey, if you're going to do this, you have to provide XYZ information.
Space station being jargon for satellites, not the space station. Yes,
exactly. Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Sure.
So yeah, every radio is a station, right, within the FCC. And so if you're outside the Earth's atmosphere, you count as a space station. So yes, I will try to stick to satellites though. So, a satellite constellation or even a geostationary application, they'll have sort of information regarding spectrum use, duration on orbit, the orbital debris mitigation rules that the commission has implemented. Those are things that you have to address in your application as well. There is some flexibility, and we'll see that flexibility sort of utilized in this application as to how much of that information you provide at the initial filing stage. Certain things you have to include them, but the commission has been flexible on other things like the orbital debris assessment report. They let large constellations sort of get further along in their design before they require that to be submitted. And they're also flexible on things like ITU filings, which, sometimes when a system's in development, you don't want to make a commitment on the ITU side before you've sort of gone through at least part of the commission process. So
the ITU being the
International Telecommunications Union. Thank you.
Okay,
and so that is in many ways sort of, it's not a regulator, but it is an international body sort of sponsored and funded by the UN that in space, it does many things, but in space, it sort of allows the different countries throughout the world to understand what's being launched and, if necessary, coordinate the spectrum use of those satellites with one another to make sure that everybody can sort of operate up there without having to worry about harmful interference, which can affect the quality of service or completely wipe out the signal if it's allowed to proliferate.
Yeah, and that from a practical point of view, you generally think of the two radio frequency filings you have to make being FCC and ITU.
Yes, I think that's a great way to look at it.
Yeah. For any mission, scientific or otherwise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, NASA has their own ITU filings. I mean, they have a different process than commercial operators, but everybody who goes up into space is filing something. It will actually be very interesting as space gets more sort of militarized to see how that's tackled. But not something I think I'll have a whole lot of purview into, but one of the many things that will sort of change as we keep moving forward.
Sure. So, I mean, I've encountered these filings for scientific missions where you're gonna communicate from Earth orbit looking down. So you file with FCC. It's one satellite or space station, or maybe in the modern constellation era of CubeSats, you might have 4 or 6 individual radios on board. So that's the normal, right? I mean, that's the everyday stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. You might.
So then, go ahead.
Well, you might see like a 200 satellite systems, things like that.
Okay.
Are becoming more common for like Earth observation, and the broadband satellites are getting into, the high hundreds, maybe low thousands. A million's very different for sure.
So this is all done through a portal online that I've seen, and presumably there's a human being on the other end of it somewhere that gets an email, says, "Hey, you got something to look at." What's your visibility, or maybe in your previous career, of like how that works at the FCC offices in some kind of, I'm just thinking like an old style office with like an intake folder and all that stuff. So what happens when those things get in?
So
those applications?
I've not sat at an FCC desk, but from my understanding, there is some sort of notification when a filing like that comes through. And in fact, there's even on the new version of the database, which is called the International Communications Filing System, there is now a list of recently filed items.
Okay.
So even the public can sort of go on that and say, oh, what's been filed in the last couple of days. But the commission will likewise internally have a list like that. And, in my experience with the commission, and particularly the Space Bureau, the same attorneys will tend to handle the same sort of operators, right? Because if someone is familiar with the SpaceX docket or the Telesat docket, it helps them sort of understand where the next application fits into the whole. I don't know that that's a hard and fast rule, but that's just been my experience. And then especially now with the new mandates to sort of move things quickly, and I think that's always the case with SpaceX in particular, chances are somebody got assigned to that very quickly and started reading through it and starting to figure out, what the commission may need in terms of additional information, or, effectively the same rules that I talked about sort of at the beginning. The commission will just go through and try to see, hey, has the applicant addressed this rule? Has the applicant addressed that rule? And in fact, in the SpaceX application, at one point, they just list a series of orbital debris mitigation rules in 2 boxes, basically, and say, yes, we're doing this. Yes, we're doing that.
Okay.
Which I've heard can facilitate the review. It just makes it easier to say, hey, this is how we're addressing this rule.
Okay. So other than the number of satellites, is it a fairly standard looking?
Oh, no.
No. Okay. So other than you address some of the points like orbital debris mitigation and things like that. I imagine satellite lifetime and things like that. The kinds of things that the normal spacecraft operators would be thinking about. What does how did this application differ other than the number?
So there are 2 like big differences. One is spectrum related, one is orbital debris or orbital location related. So the first thing that really jumped off the page was the fact that, so very quickly for some context, the way to think about spectrum when you're dealing with data communications is your channel bandwidth, right? The amount of frequency you're using to transmit a signal is kind of like your pipeline for information. It's like a fiber cable through radio frequency spectrum. So typically, and this isn't true in all cases, but typically the larger your channel, the more data you can transmit, which sometimes folks in the satellite industry will refer to as throughput. And, one of the real breakthroughs of the SpaceX Starlink system was the ability to deliver sort of previously unprecedented amounts of throughput, right? Hundreds of megabits of capacity to an individual user, not a corporation. So that's always been a big part of SpaceX, and it's part of why they operate, part of their service, and it's why they operate in the Ku band and the Ka band, because they're able to use larger channels to deliver information. So what was really sort of noticeable on the spectrum side here was that the intent to communicate to the ground with spectrum seems limited to what's called telemetry, telecommand, and control, which is basically just flying the satellites. And they've only asked for 5 megahertz carriers. So 5 megahertz in certain bands, if you're looking at like terrestrial mobile, that would be a lot. But in the satellite bands, particularly Ka band, where SpaceX is seeking to operate, you'll see channels as wide as 100 megahertz, maybe even bigger than that. So a 5 megahertz channel is, they're not delivering the data from a data center to the ground over that link. That's just not a big enough link. And my colleague, Chris Bear, who I get to work with here at WBK, was sort of the first one of us to figure out, oh, they must be doing, and I say must, but we're speculating.
Sure.
They must be relaying this data to Starlink through their optical system. So many of the new Starlink systems have an optical relay built into them, primarily for sort of shuttling traffic across the Starlink system. So if you think about Starlink, right, it's thousands of satellites proliferated all over the globe. There are a lot of instances in which a Starlink satellite is not going to be able to see the ground, right? It's over the ocean, and you don't have many Earth stations in the ocean. So what the laser sort of optical, we'll call them crosslinks, intersatellite links, basically communications from one satellite to another, it allows SpaceX to take traffic that maybe came from a user in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and then sort of hop it across satellites until it can be landed on the ground. And because of the nature of optical communications in a vacuum, it ends up being extremely fast, comparable to long haul fiber. And in fact, in certain instances, these links allow Starlink, as I've read, obviously I'm not an engineer doing the speed tests, to beat long haul fiber on latency issues, because the signal will travel faster in the vacuum of space than it would in a fiber cable.
Sure. And there's probably fewer network nodes in the way.
Exactly. So one of the great things about optical in space is there aren't things in the way, right? There aren't leaves, there aren't buildings, and so there aren't clouds. Clouds is a big sort of complication for doing optical in space from the ground. But when you're in space and there's nothing there except a few other satellites, it does, you're dealing with line of sight issues. And if everybody's got the right equipment and there's a way to sort of track your target and maintain sort of the connection, optical in space becomes a lot easier. And so my guess would be that the plan here is to mostly avoid spectrum and rely on the existing Starlink system, which has its own spectrum authorizations to deliver assuming these are data centers, delivering the data, receiving or then delivering the data to the ground.
So you made a good comment there. So the application doesn't actually have to specify the use of these satellites, correct?
Correct.
So we don't know whether this is telecom or orbital compute, as people are calling it, whether or not.
So let me clarify. So you are supposed to tell them what you're going to do, but those things change. And so we have seen applicants come in and say, hey, we're going to do this one thing. And then over the years, they realize that their hardware is better suited to another market or service, and then they'll sort of pivot. A really great example of that might be Kepler Communications, where I think they first filed with the FCC in 2015. And at the time, they were looking to be a sort of like a lower cost, I think, satellite broadband provider. And at this moment in time, because of their hardware, because of their positioning in terms of spectrum authority, they're now building out a new business model where they are an optical data relay network on orbit. So we do see pivots. And, at some point you have to go back to the FCC and say, look, I know we said this, but it turns out we're actually going to do this. But I don't think there's any reason to think SpaceX isn't being, straight with us here, because they already have a massive satellite system. So I think if they are saying they're going to do something different, that would be my expectation.
Well, what I was thinking of was you mentioned that the actual spectrum requested was relatively narrow and perhaps better suited for spacecraft operational information rather than customer data, which seems odd in comparison to the enormous scale of the proposed constellation, or I should say stated constellation. I wouldn't call it proposed. So what I'm hearing is maybe this is like, let's get this biggest possible application in before anyone else does and claim the spectrum at scale because we can. I mean, is that overly simplistic?
So SpaceX has said that they would like to use the spectrum on a non-interference basis. And that's, I think, plausible, in part because they are very narrow channels, and SpaceX has, I feel comfortable saying this. I don't know for a fact, but it probably has the biggest gateway network in the world, which means there are a lot of places where it can land traffic. And so, and we'll talk a little bit more about the orbital location in a minute, but the way to think about it is, okay, so Starlink is sort of in LEO, which is about, at this point, they're now like 360 to 550 kilometers above the Earth's surface. The their proposals for the data centers starts at 500 kilometers and goes all the way up to 2,000 kilometers.
Okay.
So what we're going to have is these data centers are going to be a little bit further up for the most part than the Starlink satellites, which will allow them to sort of target it with their optical array. Again, speculating.
Sure.
So it makes it easier when you are dealing with sort of a broader viewpoint. It'll allow you to target more satellites. And then those links from the data center to the Starlink satellite, because they're optical, will probably be able to carry quite a bit of data traffic. And then the Starlink system itself is designed through radio frequency to bring a lot of traffic down to the ground, right? Each one of those Starlink gateways probably processes, or is capable of processing hundreds of gigabits per second, because that is the nature of their system. And they serve a lot of customers who have fiber-like expectations in terms of connectivity. So in some ways, I think what they're doing is just building off their existing network in a way that would be hard for others to replicate just because of their scale and their deployment state. And that lets them sort of rely less on spectrum, I think is probably the best way to put it, because now they can offload this traffic to their existing sort of spectrum platform. And all they need to do is, and again, speculative, sort of say, hey, we're going to use RF radio frequency to fly the satellites. And that's pretty much it, because we can now land the data through our NGSO constellation and use that RF without getting a new authorization. So in a lot of ways, I think it's a really clever way to sort of lessen the potential impact on the use of spectrum, but also facilitate maybe a speedier regulatory review, because there's just not a whole lot, I think, for the commission to dig in on the spectrum side based on what SpaceX has put forward.
Okay. So getting to the location of the satellites, it's sun synchronous, right? So
it's not. Sun synchronous is one of the inclinations they have articulated. And this was really interesting as well. They want to go from 30 degrees inclination to, I think, sun synchronous. And then they want to do that at altitudes sort of incrementally from 500 kilometers to 2,000 kilometers. So if folks are familiar with Jonathan McDowell, he's actually modeled what the shells might look like on his website. And I can send you a link after this if you'd like to share that with your users. Jonathan McDowell, by the way, just an amazing resource in terms of tracking what's on orbit. I highly recommend anyone who's interested to check out what he does on Twitter. But the idea, as far as I can tell, is you will just have these shells sort of from 30 degrees to sun synchronous orbit of these data centers, sort of at incremental altitudes, which will create different look angles and allow them to communicate with the Starlink system without becoming their own source of interference, right? Because opaque things are opaque things. So this will, as you go up, the geometry changes, and this will allow potentially multiple data centers at the same inclination, the ability to communicate with the Starlink system, because they'll be at different altitudes. And then the look angles change enough so that you don't have to worry about interference.
So I want to go back to one question about the spectrum, the throughput that's reserved. So these being in theory AI data centers, do you read that amount of spectrum requested as that's what they're going to use to send the output for the customer back to Starlink to send down? Or is it just the operational data so that the things can be operated? Kind of like the control of a ground data center.
So I think, and based on the application, I think this is a safe thing to say, that the intent is not to transit any customer data over the RF, and it will just be used
purely
to fly the satellite.
Operations. Okay, interesting. Because then would the actual operational customer data be transmitted under a future application if that's not covered by this one?
That's what I think the optical links will be for. So the optical links will allow very high throughput, high data rates.
Sure.
Because that is the nature of optical.
Right. So you're saying that the AI units, the nodes themselves will also have laser links both to each other and to the Starlink constellation.
Yes. I want to be clear that that's not clearly stated, but that is sort of the assumption, looking at, hey, if you're only using 5 megahertz channels to fly the satellites, how are you going to move the customer data? And so we're sort of, the thought is, well, they have these inter-satellite optical systems, and that must be the way that they're doing it, because otherwise, you're right. We know how much data that involves too. How does that get there if they're not doing it over these TT&C links? So I think optical is the answer.
Okay.
Otherwise, you would be right. If they're going to try and do this through RF, they'll have to come back for another bite at the apple to get more frequency, I would expect.
Sure. And it would seem to make sense that having mastered the optical links already, that they could just copy and paste that onto the orbital compute nodes. Um,
Yeah.
the geometry allowing. So the next question that comes to me is, what is the obligation of the FCC to take seriously anything that comes into that system? Suppose I say I'm going to build the Starship Enterprise, and I'm going to have, the dry dock in low Earth orbit with all of that, radio equipment. Do they have to take that seriously and give me the spectrum if I otherwise check all the boxes?
That's a really good question. The first thing the commission will do will evaluate the application based on the rules, right? So if someone
Mm,
came in with the Starship Enterprise, they'd be looking, I think, for a reason to say, oh, you didn't complete this application, so we're going to dismiss it. But
okay.
if you came in and you did everything right, I
Yeah.
do think there's still like an evaluation within the Bureau to say, how fast do we think this is going to move, right? I don't think they sit there and say, is
Okay.
this real? Although
Uh-huh.
this one they might.
Uh-huh.
And what I think you'll often see if you look at the record is if folks go in and keep telling the Bureau, hey, we need this soon,
Uh-huh.
we're getting ready to launch, the Bureau is responsive to that. There are applications that have been on file for years and are
Mm,
mostly untouched. The Bureau did sort of do a check-in earlier, maybe it was late last year. So it would have been last year because we're in February. So the Bureau did a check-in with some of these long-standing applications just to make sure they were still viable. There were ways to sort of say, yeah, we're still working on it, but we're not in a rush. And I think
okay.
the commission is open to that so long as
Mm,
there is some plausibility there. I don't know that they would dismiss something out of hand just because it's ridiculous,
mm.
but they might sort of deprioritize it if they think it's not likely to
Okay.
happen anytime
So
soon.
it's kind of like a soft triage, kind of. So like if a crackpot applies for something, does not have the visibility and political pressure or will and capital that Elon Musk has, it might get kind of put in the lower on the list. But my understanding is that any other bureaucracy, they can't ignore you. They have
Right.
a statutory obligation to review your application, but they also don't have to prioritize you.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the commission also has the discretion to ask questions. And so if
Okay.
they see something and they say, well, that's going to cost $1 trillion, how are you going to pay for
Yeah.
it? I don't know that they could ask that question, but they might ask other questions about your supply chain, your launch plans,
Okay.
things like that to understand sort of the viability of what you're proposing. So anything where you're trying to launch, more mass than has ever been launched before, or a
Sure.
starship beyond the capabilities of known
Yeah.
technology, yeah, that will probably trigger some questions.
Well, so then this would certainly seem to be in that category, 1,000,000 satellites. I mean, surely they would, if it was my job to take that seriously, I would want a schedule. I would want, how are you going to launch 1,000,000 satellites? I would want, I don't know, probably I would want ask absolutely everything I could possibly ask within my statutory authority just before I don't know, because it seems like well, I mean, what do you think? Do you think this is going to open up all those questions? Or are they just gonna treat it like it was a, satellite operated lawnmower?
So I do think, SpaceX spends some time harping on their history, their
Mm,
flight legacy, and I
mm,
think that's appropriate. So I think for them to do it will probably generate less scrutiny than anyone else because they have their history of doing things no one else has done and they put more mass on orbit than anyone else out there. So I do think just by the nature of what they've already accomplished, they have more credibility than any other applicant coming in and saying we're going to do 1 million satellites. But I do expect there to be questions.
mm,
SpaceX, for example, talks about using this spectrum on a non-interference basis, and that's easier said than done, I think.
mm,
And so they may ask questions about that. They haven't put forward one of the requirements is an orbital debris assessment report, which is sort of a simulation/calculation model to assess orbital debris risk.
mm.
They didn't provide that, which is not uncommon, but at some point they'll have to.
Sure.
And so there remain a lot of open questions as to how this is actually going to work. And I am certain that the commission will follow up on that. The thing I will sort of add for context is there's always the possibility that an operator can go in and talk to the commission before they
Mhm,
file an application. There's no need for anyone to file something that says, hey, we went to talk to the FCC about this.
mm,
I think it's possible that SpaceX sort of let the commission know what was coming through and the Bureau may have some of the answers that we don't. And it's also possible they just cold filed it, and we'll see sort of a request from the FCC for further information about what they're planning to do.
So you mentioned there's no orbital debris plan. That would seem to be fairly important for 1 million satellites, approximately, if they're 50 kilograms each, 50 million kilograms of steel and aluminum in orbit. So now the technical challenge of modeling 1 million satellites is pretty intense. But I'm just wondering, I mean, presumably they checked enough boxes that they wouldn't be rejected, right? But like, that seems like a pretty, I could argue it's not the best faith, from the outside, it's not the best faith statement to make. Hey, we're going to put up 1 million satellites. Oh, we'll get you the debris solution later.
So I certainly understand that perspective. And to some degree, you do have to wonder about timing. It's like, well, could you not have waited longer? But systems like this, or any large NGSO system, does take a little bit of time to design, right? I'm sure you've been part of preliminary design reviews, and then you get I forget what a CDR is, but there are always these different stages, and things change. And especially now with the supply chain influx, I think it does make sense that maybe folks haven't scoped out sort of the entirety of what their spacecraft is going to look like. To clarify, the SpaceX hasn't fully sort of avoided the orbital debris rules. They've avoided providing the report, but they have sort of gone through and said, yes, we will meet this. Yes, we will meet that. There wasn't a whole lot of detail, but one of the really interesting things was on post-mission disposal, where they're going to launch, as they do now, these data centers sort of at a very low orbit. And if they don't work, they'll just sort of immediately deorbit. But for the ones that do work and they are able to orbit raise, the plan is either to dispose of them in a disposal altitude above 2,000 kilometers, which is permitted by the commission rules, but is sort of underreported because no one does it.
Yeah.
The other option is and I don't know how this will work, they'll dispose it into the sun. So that is a really interesting and different approach that I've not seen before. Yeah, I think they said it heliocentric disposal or something like that. So if you had enough juice, I guess you'd throw it into the right orbit.
That's not credible. It is incredibly hard to make things hit the sun. So that is a really interesting statement for them to make, knowing it would be looked at. To hit the sun, you have to basically eliminate all of the Earth's angular momentum around the sun, which is a lot.
Yeah,
I've been around the sun for a long time. So that is really interesting that would be in there. And to suggest that, and I'm saying this on a recording partially because if I'm wrong, that would be amazing, but I don't see a way that I could be. Although I'm always happy. I'm happy to be right, and I'm happy to be wrong. But point being that the idea that you could use a low Earth orbit satellite's propulsion system to escape Earth's orbit and impact the sun is pretty comical. So it really gets to the question of like, how much do they have to take it seriously? And like, can someone point that out and say, that's not possible? Or at least that's so close to impossible unless this orbital data platform is also an unprecedentedly advanced propulsion system. Can they push back on that?
Yeah. So actually, anyone can comment on the application. There's a public notice period, but you can also file informal comments sort of whenever you feel like, once it's been filed. As someone who doesn't know, I was just thinking about like in The Expanse when they send the protomolecule into the sun. That seemed pretty straightforward, but what you say makes sense. Someone who was able to sort of say, wait a second, this is hard to do. We need you to show your work on it. That's entirely appropriate within the FCC process. And that's part of why these applications are publicly available, so that the public has an opportunity to comment.
Interesting. Okay. And you're saying the public can comment, and someone in the public could ask that question. Hey, how are you going to go from 300 kilometers of Earth orbit to the sun?
Yeah.
To 0 kilometers of the sun's orbit.
Anyone could do that. I will say that like everything else, the commission will sort of gauge the credibility of commenters. There are sort of somewhat commonly, particularly in the 5G proceedings, folks who will post about things that are hard to believe, personal experiences, things like that. So they do have sort of a threshold. But if someone files something credible, right, and they introduce themselves and explain why they know these things, then that does get weight, even if it is just a single person.
Interesting. So I want to get into a coincidental timing here, that this filing claims a million space vehicles when a SpaceX IPO is just around the corner. So I wonder what you think of that observation that I am not the first person to make.
This is probably something where I should be careful on, but I think that's a perceptive observation. What I have found dealing with folks who are interested in space, but maybe don't work in space, is that sometimes a high level marketing sort of statement can go a long way to encouraging enthusiasm. Even if, folks in the industry look at it and say, how would that work? But I'll also note, when SpaceX came around, there was a lot of that reaction too. So one of the things I have learned to do is maybe bite my tongue a little bit about SpaceX. I've been wrong so many times, but I think you're not wrong to notice that sort of how those two things seem to be dovetailing. And there's also a question of how much, when we talk about space traffic management and managing a system of this scale, how much like AI is going to play a role in that. It's not super clear. I have no particular information about it, but at that point, how do you do that with human beings is, I think, a really interesting question too. There may be something to it. There may be a real value add to having your internal AI. I think your Occam's razor, at least from my perspective, suggests that you're probably more spot on than that sort of theory is.
Well, and I'll go one step further, or at least raise the question one step further, which is, the Musk companies have been in trouble in the past for various public statements affecting markets. And I'm wondering if a way around that jurisdiction of the SEC might be to make a public claim in an FCC filing that one knows is going to get a lot of publicity. So I'm wondering if there's any history of basically FCC filings being used to get around, restrictions on market moving speech.
That is a really interesting question. I think the first thing to remember is this is like the first time ever that commercial space has been a mainstream news consideration, right? What SpaceX's imprint on the markets, for example, is significantly different. Even like operators like SES and Intelsat at their height, the satellite industry has always been a very small part of the telecommunications industry. And so, there are always evaluations of, hey, does this create a monopoly or something? But it's hard to, at least in my experience, recall a time where, the actions of a satellite operator at the FCC could affect the market. So I think this is probably the first time it could be used as something like that. And I think that's a very perceptive way to sort of look at this. And it will be interesting to see as other publicly traded companies become more, sort of part of this, like Amazon, but potentially others down the road too, whether they can also use the FCC filing to drive interest. And it's funny because usually companies are trying to hide their FCC filing as long as possible, right? They don't want you to know that it's coming, but you have to file it at some point, and then it becomes public. So it's sort of an inversion of like the traditional industry approach, but that's what you've come to expect from SpaceX. So maybe I think you're onto something. I honestly hadn't necessarily thought about it that way, but I see a lot of logic and reason to believe that might be the case.
Well, and it raises some interesting questions about speech restriction and other legal topics that are important. I don't know. Maybe, hopefully, someday I can. Maybe someone will write about this topic, and there'll be some precedents. I'm sure that there's thousands of pages of record on debates on market moving speech. Maybe I'll go look into it now that I think about it. Or maybe I'm just in a rabbit hole. It's hard to know these days what's a rabbit hole and what's plausible.
I think that's a really interesting thing to explore because you are required to make these statements publicly.
Yeah.
If you're clever about it, why wouldn't that be a way to generate some interest?
Right.
And so I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, if you do have a chance to look into it, I'd love to hear what you figure out.
Well, I'll do that. I may have asked this question a little differently earlier, but I want to explore a little more of that. The big round number of 1 million satellites, does that preclude it? Could that have been chosen partially to stake a claim sort of that would preclude someone else from jumping in at that scale? Or is it not really evaluated that way? Because it's also conveniently large, easy to remember number,
Yeah. That's a really good question. And I think the commission has generally been hands off on that and said,
okay,
if there are two NGSO operators in the same orbit, you all have a strong incentive to not run into each other. And we're going to let you figure that out.
Okay.
And that has sort of been the approach, right? Because SpaceX covers many different systems at this point, some of which are hundreds of satellites big. There was a time where they were sort of jockeying over this. I mentioned Kepler earlier. They and SpaceX had a disagreement about who was able to use, I think it was like 540 kilometers, but guess what? They figured it out because these orbits are huge. Is I think something that is hard to think about. And I was actually curious about this myself. So Google's Gemini is amazing at figuring out things on orbit.
Yes.
And so I asked it to calculate what's the area of sun synchronous orbit. I think it was like 530 kilometers. It's a lot. It's about the size of Maine, right? And that's just one ring around the Earth.
Okay.
If you bound it by like a kilometer in every direction.
Sure.
So if you look at it this way, there's something like 67 degrees of inclination that they're requesting at 1,500 kilometers of altitude. It's conceivable these things could be spread out. And again, that's where I think it will be interesting to learn more about how they're planning to do this, because if they spread these things out inclination by inclination every 20 kilometers or something like that, then you might have orbital shells that, I mean, are still going to be massive compared to what we're used to, but they're not going to take up all the space in the orbit.
Sure.
Everybody is sort of wondering how this might work in sun synchronous orbit in particular, you know, where there are a lot of LEOs, some of which don't have propulsion.
Well, that's the best real estate, really.
Exactly.
For anything has to work that doesn't have to transmit straight down. I mean, for those listening, sun synchronous orbit basically means you're constantly facing the sun for power. And I won't try to describe the geometry in words anymore in an audio recording, but it's the best power generating real estate up there.
Right.
So everyone wants to be there.
Yeah. And obviously the data center thing is that's where it makes the most sense, because you just have this steady stream of power. So you were right, I think, to call out sun synchronous orbit, right? If you're looking at it from a physics perspective, that's the place that makes the most sense. But they do seem to have a plan to branch out beyond that, which, you know, again, it's very vague at the moment, and it'll be very interesting to see how they execute it. If I were guessing, and that's exactly what I'm doing, I would guess that they go to sun synchronous orbit as quickly as they could and start there. And in part because they do a lot of launches already for their transporter rides, usually go to sun synchronous orbit. So they're used to it. They know how to do it. And yeah, that is the place I think they'd want to be. But I think they're also sensitive to the fact that a lot of their customers operate there, and maybe they have found a way to space this out. I can't believe I use that term, in a way that doesn't impact everybody as much as it might seem to.
Sure. Well, I think we're in for some uncommonly interesting FCC dialogue in the public media. I've never actually read a filing before that I wasn't working on the mission for, but I'm gonna keep an eye on the updates for this one. Any final thoughts? I mean, it's such an interesting time in telecom that it's even on the public radar, at all. But what do you think? What do you want to leave our audience with today to think about?
Well, so the last time we met, we talked about sort of the impact of space and space regulation on everyone's lives. And this, if we start putting our data in space, it's really going to change, right? That is sort of a next step in which our networks and our sort of electronic existence now is fully integrated into hardware that's on orbit. So all of a sudden, space goes from sort of a cursory thing where we use it to navigate, we use it for location and things like that on an everyday basis to, gosh, every time I send an email, that thing might be going up into orbit.
Yeah. I was just thinking that the inbox is summarizing emails from space.
Yeah, exactly.
Perhaps.
And so I think, in a lot of ways, I haven't figured out what that means yet. And I don't think anyone has, because it's such a new idea, but it does seem like it's got the prospect of really changing things. And then when you have that much computing power on orbit, how does that work to supplement further build outs as we get further and further away from Earth as well? So, I don't know. I've seen enough folks that I respect say, the data centers on orbit is sort of a pipe dream from a physics perspective. And then I've seen people I respect say it's possible. If this happens, I think it will be sort of a tipping point for how space interacts with our day-to-day lives. And if it doesn't, I think it's still going to spark a further interest in the industry. I think wherever SpaceX goes, you're likely to see others follow.
Yeah.
And so it's absolutely worth monitoring. There will be some entertaining back and forths. There will be more information coming from SpaceX. So all of this, I think, will be a really good story to track. And if anyone's interested in commercial space, you're going to see a lot of the live issues get brought up here and sort of in some ways figured out in real time as folks figure out what an application like this means.
Well, on the feasibility topic, I will simply remind the listener that of all the natural forces of the universe, thermodynamics always wins. And I'll leave it at that. So what an interesting topic this is. I think we'll have a lot more to say, maybe even another episode. Thank you, Will, for joining me again. Congratulations on your new role. And this is the Space Madness Podcast, episode 40. Signing off. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Jeff.